Welcome to Xagility. I'm your host, John Coleman.
Author and Agendashift founder Mike Burrows describes himself as in the business of wholehearted organizations. Mike is recognized for his pioneering work in Lean, Agile, and Kanban, for his groundbreaking books Agendashift 2018 and now 2021, Right to Left 2019, audiobook 2020, and Kanban from the Inside in 2014, and is a champion of participatory and outcome-oriented.
Yes.
Thank you. And outcome-oriented approaches to change, transformation, strategy, and leadership. Before embarking on his consulting career, he was global development manager and executive director at a top-tier investment bank and CTO for an energy risk management startup. So it's a nice blend of agility and executive leadership there, Mike.
Indeed.
So, Mike, delighted to be reading your second edition of Agendashift.
Great, enjoy.
Yeah, thank you. I had Pia Maria Thorin on the first episode of the podcast.
Oh, wonderful, yes.
Yeah.
We're doing a meetup tomorrow.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, she's wonderful. And so that was nice. And I actually read the first book already. And I'm kind of curious why you came out with a second edition so quickly. Can you give us the background?
Yeah, well, it's 3 years, but 3 years in the, if you think of Agendashift as like a startup or a bootstrap, started 2015, 2016, like 3 years is like half its lifetime. And, our the state of the art in terms of practice and of knowledge has moved on quite a lot in that time. So there's like refinements to existing exercises. If you're not familiar with the book, then a lot of the book is built around workshop exercises, which people can do, which you can use as like a template for coaching conversations and leadership conversations as well. So we've refined those. We've added some new ones. We've taken a few away. A couple of things have moved to the back of the book because they're not quite as important now as they were 3 years ago. But some bigger changes as well, which didn't change the overall flow so much, but it gave it some clarity. So recognizing that there were some key patterns that just kept repeating, we kind of knew they were there and kind of hinted at them in the first edition, but we've given them names now. And the book is very clearly organized around them. So that's really helpful. The second thing is, we've been, as I said, knowledge, we've been digging deep and very collaboratively reaching out to and working with people from other communities, the strategy community, the organization development community, and so on. And through those collaborations, through those conversations, through thousands of pages of reading, it feels like it's on much more solid foundations now. And we look to in the OD community, for example, dialogic OD has been like the breakthrough of the last 20 years. And the time that Agile has been, coming to fruition, the OD community was going through a radical change of its own. And it turns out, I didn't know it at the time when I started, but it was very obvious when I started reading what they were up to that we were incredibly well aligned. I was so excited when I read the dialogic OD book, and even more excited when I read the generative change book. And realizing that it was so easy to do like a one-for-one reconciliation between that book and mine. And we've been digging deep on the systems side as well. So you'll see at the back of the book, kind of the last chapter is really a reconciliation of Agendashift with a viable systems model, which is like the management consultant's secret weapon, really. It takes a little bit of effort to get your head around it, but it's just so worth it. And you realize it explains so much about what does and doesn't work in organizations. And it seemed, I mean, that actually was going to be just an appendix, and it kind of grew, and it's got a life of its own now. And we've got this thing called the Deliberately Adaptive Organization, which is essentially Agendashift plugged into the viable system model. And we've tried to make that as accessible as we possibly can. So that's thing number two. That's the foundations thing. Patterns thing first, foundations thing second. And the third thing is just, the year 2019, 2020, 2021, it's COVID. And I came back from a couple of foreign trips at the beginning of last year. And long before, Boris said we were going into lockdown, I actually quarantined myself because, I have a vulnerable family member, my daughter. And I had to keep myself away from the rest of the family, for that time until it was sure I was safe. And I thought, I'm not sure this is going to blow over. And I made a decision there and then. It was still only probably February, maybe early March, but it was around that sort of time that I had to work very quickly to work out how to do Agendashift online. Something that's been, was a in-room workshop thing. How can I make it work with not just with Zoom, but with breakout rooms? I love small group conversations and sending people out and integrating and all that kind of stuff. And how do you send people out to a breakout room and for them to know what they're doing, and to capture what they were doing and those kind of things? There's some questions of facilitation, practice, technique, and also of the the resources that you give to people. And so the book was an opportunity to share some of what I've learned about putting it online, and doing it through different mediums, different platforms actually teaches you something about the material as well. And there's a few moments where by making that change, we actually arrived at some insights of our own, and that was very interesting. So those are the three big reasons, really, and they're all big reasons. I think any one of them might have been enough to justify a second edition, but with the three of them together, it was a no-brainer, really.
Yeah, and you had the opportunity as well, I guess, with the quarantine as well.
Indeed, yes. So yes, every cloud and all the rest of it. So yeah, I used the time to do the audio book of Right to Left, and then the second edition of Agendashift. Yeah,
brilliant. So you've got a conference coming up, don't you? An Agendashift conference. Is that the first conference you've ever had?
It is. Yeah, it feels like we're growing up now. So yeah, May 18th. And we haven't actually published the full lineup of speakers yet, but I can promise you there are going to be some surprising names there. Some big names from not just within the Agendashift community, but from I mentioned that we've put our feelers out to other communities, and I've just been so grateful for the support that I've had. I mean, it was a bit like back in the early days, the support I had from the clean language community was incredible as well. And I've made some great friends there. And I'm not trying to take anything over. It's more, I'm very glad when Agendashift is a gateway drug to something else. And I really sort of celebrate all our sources. Try not to cherry pick, but try to give something of the flavor and the spirit. And kind of the values of these different models and the different communities they come from, and get some of their key people as friends as well. And that's really cool.
Yeah, we're going to get back to the cue cards later on and clean language, which I found very useful. That basically you could just pick these, and it's kind of like a starter for 10, so to speak.
Yeah.
But before we get into that, just on the growth of your community. So, like, when did you actually start this whole Agendashift thing?
I think sort of in terms of the work I was doing, sort of mostly on my own. So 2015, we launched officially. I think it was March 2016. So we're 5 years old, and we're up to and I that's when I launched essentially the partner program. And I'm full of admiration for the people that signed up for the partner program when it started, because they can't possibly have known what they were signing up for. And I'm really grateful that there was a group of people that put some trust in me. And it did take a while before it took the shape that it has now. But we're up now to coming up to 150 partners around the world. And these are people that have access to the assessment tool, to the workshop materials, and all the rest of it. And what's been most exciting this year, it's still very early days, I'll be honest, but we're starting to sort of like eat our own dog food in the community. We've doing our own strategy reviews as a community, which is kind of tools that I developed in Right to Left and in Agendashift. Organizing ourselves in circles around particular questions. There's a marketing circle, for example, that's really stepped up to get the conference together. And it felt for the best part of 5 years that nothing happened if I didn't instigate it myself. And there are now some amazing things happening because other people have decided it should happen. The conference is one of those things. I'm not sure I might have loved to have had a conference, but I didn't feel ready to instigate it myself. And we're about to launch, by the time this podcast comes out, we will have launched some self-paced training and the Agendashift Academy as well. And again, I couldn't have done that without the help of other people. So one of the partners, friend of mine, Kjell Tore Guttormsen, based in Norway, has worried about the platform side of things and the marketing side of things for the academy. And all I've had to do is just sort of turn up and do my thing, record the videos, make sure that there's materials for people and so on. And it's it's a really, really great collaboration there, and that's by no means the first collaboration that we've had in the community, and some great stuff being created every year. Liz Keogh and Carl Scotland did option relationship mapping, as we now call it. That was my favourite innovation of 2019, for example. Fantastic tool. Mike Harbour contributed a template for Celebration 5W, which is the workshop kickoff exercise that I use almost every workshop, and it's quite a popular tool. I found partners to practice on when I was trying something new. A challenge mapping I was really excited about that last year. Practiced it on Andreas. It's just so cool to have people to collaborate with and practice with, and you can afford to take a few risks when you're working with friends, if that's me. Yeah.
Sounds brilliant. The circles. How does that work in practice, Mike? How would you even start with something like that?
Yeah, so that's a term I borrowed from sociocracy. It turns out to be a really important model for the later chapters of the book. It's a great model for self-organization at scale. A lot of people, when they think about self-organization, it doesn't go much further than sort of self-management within teams. People choosing what work to do, people choosing who to collaborate with, and that kind of thing. But you can take that up to any level. It just gets harder. But you can think in terms of teams collaborating with each other and thinking about the relationships between them. You can think about people moving between teams so that the shape and the overall balance of the organization changes. It might only change by one person at a time, perhaps, or it might be a more dramatic change than that. But it's a really flexible model, but with some really profound principles to it as well. So the principle is, the really most important principle, that everything's by consent. People are members of circles by consent, and they could be members of multiple circles. I mean, you can think of Spotify as being, those horizontal and vertical stripes. You can think of those as circles. If the people are there by consent, if they govern themselves by consent, subject to whatever they've agreed with their parent circles and so on, and there's a particular encouragement for circles to overlap, to intersect, two or more people in the intersection between circles, and particularly with two people in the intersection between circles, you create mentoring opportunities, growth opportunities for people. And in Right to Left, I used it to describe a real case study that I did in Government Digital. I actually didn't know it was I didn't know it as sociocracy at the time. But in retrospect, the model fitted that case study incredibly well. People there by consent, really motivated by the purpose of the overall thing and of the circles or teams that they belong to. People with multiple roles, people in multiple circles, self-governing, everything. I mean, they didn't do anything that sort of violated the model. And I realized that you could use it as a way of looking at organizations as well as a set of practices to implement. If you look at things like Sociocracy 3.0 and Holacracy, they're sold a bit more in terms of, do these meetings, these are the ceremonies you do in your meetings, the tools, the practices, and so on. I've gone right to the really basic 3 principles. People join by consent, they govern by consent, and they with the encouragement to double linking, and that's almost all you need. And then in the last months, year 2, we've had things like team topologies, dynamic reteaming, and we're starting to get other people talking about what is effectively self-organization at scale, and that circles idea fits really well with those. I mean, I think the innovation of team topologies is it starts to think about, well, there are identifies different kinds of relationships between teams, service relationships or enablement relationships, for example. And what Heidi did with dynamic reteaming was that encouragement to allow people to move between teams, either of their own volition or when the organization needs it to happen to respond to something, or to create development opportunities and so on. So I would, there's 2 things that I think the Agile community does a disservice to. One of them is servant leadership, and the other is self-organization. And they are both really profound ideas if you understand that actually they can scale to the level of the whole organization. They're not just about how a team manages itself, or how its Scrum Master serves the team and so on. Much bigger concepts than those. And I just always encourage people to think organizationally. I've done it for a long time. I mean, from my Kanban days and before, I've been doing it for a decade. You can't just think in terms of process. You can't just think in terms of structure. You need to think about organizations as social things, socially constructed through their conversations and all the rest of it. And you bring the systems side in as well with self-organization, and that's a really powerful combination.
So what kind of culture do you think, or well, that's probably the bad way to say it, but what level of consciousness do you think needs to be there for these circles to work? I mean, does the organization need to be at a really conscious state before you can even think of that, or actually have you seen it operating in places where previously they had a very strict hierarchy and they just moved over?
Yeah, so I consider myself very fortunate to have worked in the Government Digital Services exemplar projects, 2 of them. So this isn't, for those of you that don't know, the UK did a very exciting thing around government digital a few years ago, and they set up a number of these exemplar projects, which are really labs for proving new ways of doing government digital. And you've got to understand that these are happening within government departments and government agencies, and led by civil servants and all the rest of it, and notoriously hierarchical and grade conscious and all the rest of it. And yet we were able to do something where badges were left at the door, where we had teams that were a mixture of consultants and staff, and we were very clear about what our purpose was. We were it wasn't just consultants coming in to build something and walk away. One of the clever things about the GDS model is that you had to demonstrate how it was sustainable. And that takes a very close partnership between the members of staff and suppliers if they're going to achieve that, and some good relationships with sponsors and all these other things. So they were amazing projects. If it was a privilege to have worked on them. And the second of those that I did became my case study for sociocracy and right to left. I could go further back thinking, but I'm just thinking of as you know, as we speak. I mean, I was a global development manager at an investment bank in the run up to or during the credit crunch. I mean, a horrific time to be in charge of a global department in fixed income securities as well. I mean, like the worst possible area to be in. I remember doing a talk in India a few years ago, talking about different kinds of organization structures, and we kind of every possible organization structure you could think of, we had examples of it. Because the department was big enough. When your department's big enough, you can actually have different things going on. It actually gets. So the weird thing is, it actually gets easier. We had like feature teams and project teams and customer line teams and so on, and if you looked hard enough, you could find examples of all of those around the world. But we made it work, and and actually I thought we had a great culture in that department as well. I inherited a great team. I'm certainly not taking all the credit for it.
Sounds brilliant.
Yeah.
I just want to ask you about, because you just prompted a thought in my head that, okay, so you're able to try different things. Did you see any example of what's known as a parallel organization where, you kind of just start something new, kind of bubble or satellite of goodness, so to speak? Have you had any experience of that?
That I have seen that, and it wasn't always successful. It sometimes creates a bit of resentment. That was probably true, actually, even in the government projects. We always had a get out of jail card. We're the exemplar project, and you don't want to get in our way. It can work wonders with change management teams, for example. I'm not a super fan of the bubble idea. Great if you can make it work. My thing, and it's what Agendashift is all about, is about organizations having the conversations with themselves that they need to have in order to work out what kind of organization do they want to be, what do they want it to look like, what obstacles are in the way of that, and now what must we do to achieve the outcomes that are hiding ready for us behind those obstacles. That's a pattern that we repeat. It's a very easy pattern to remember. It's a very teachable pattern. And the first two chapters are built around that pattern, and the pattern pops up in other places through the book. So the bubble could be an experiment, but I wouldn't. What I'm trying to do is be really clear about what principle. It's principle number 2, but it's the most important one. Agreement on outcomes before everything else. Agreement on outcomes before solutions, and a bubble is a kind of solution. A process framework is a kind of solution. The big challenge that Agendashift addresses is provide a viable, practical alternative to the rollout model. Trying to upgrade your organization like you're upgrading your email server. It might have looked good in print in the 1990s, but it's no one likes having process forced on them. No one likes being told we're changing the way that you work. And there are such better ways of doing it, ones that encourage participation and engagement, where people are invited into the process, where the outcomes are what comes first. And people are going to find smart and organizationally acceptable ways of achieving those outcomes. Starting to put strategy in the hands of teams rather than strategying something that's handed to them, done to them. Yeah. So that's really what the whole thing is about.
Yeah, I'd like to kind of start walking through the book. I'm in the introduction section now, and there's a heading here that really caught my attention about Agendashift being in the business of building wholehearted organizations. Yeah. And if I kind of just read it out, obstacles, imbalances, and contradictions recognized and owned as opportunities for authentic engagement. Strategy, organization development, and delivery is integrated, made whole through meaningful participation, celebrated for anticipating and meeting real needs, and the language of outcomes, inviting leadership at every level. So new conversations and new kinds of conversations, renewing the organization's discourse and thereby the organization itself. That's a really nice paragraph there. How long did it take you to
Well,
get to that place?
yeah, I mean, those are quite carefully chosen words, as you can imagine. And actually,
Yeah.
that's actually went through a number of iterations with the community, and there's a bit of a history to it. So I quoted Christopher Alexander from The Timeless Way of Building, classic book on architecture. And Christopher Alexander, the father of the patterns movement. And he talked about buildings being wholehearted and not being torn apart by their internal contradictions and conflicts and all the rest of it. And we talked about wholeness and health and that kind of thing. And it was kind of almost a throwaway sentence in the book, in the Right to Left book. What if we saw ourselves as being in the business of building wholehearted organizations? I read the Christopher Alexander book, thinking of architecture as a metaphor for organization design. And I blogged about it. This is while I was still writing Right to Left. And we were doing a workshop in London very shortly after that. And we had what we now call the wholehearted curry. Most of the workshop attendees, plus several others, joined us for a curry. And we were quite fortunate to have a corner table. I say corner, it was like 16 people or something in the corner of a basement. We had 2 walls we could use, stuff was going on the walls, people were sharing stuff and so on. Really cool evening. And the one thing I realized very, very quickly is that we couldn't let wholehearted mean some kind of process and get really prescriptive about it. And those words you got there is about as far as I want to go in describing what wholehearted is, because it's a generative thing. If people get sense of, energy and integration and wholeness out of the word wholehearted, that in a way is enough. That gives them something to reflect on, and you can start to imagine, well, why isn't our organization a completely wholehearted one? And that old pattern again, what stops that? What are the obstacles in the way of that? What outcomes are in wait for us behind those obstacles and so on. So it's a deliberately generative image, to use some jargon from the organization development community. Try not to be too specific about it. And then the more technical stuff. So there's 2 visions of the organization. There's the wholehearted organization, and then the deliberately adaptive organization is the more technical stuff. So that's that's the system stuff. Viable systems model with Agendashift plugged into it as a model for how business agility can work at every scale. I mean, starting at team level and going up to organization level, but also going down even to the level of sort of individuals on their own in terms of their developments and their collaborations with people around them and so on. I'm just very fortunate to found models that scale so easily. And I've not made the mistake that Agile keeps making, of thinking that you can start with a delivery process, scale it up, and pretend that it's a model of an organization, and it just isn't. It's a very impoverished model of organization, if that's all you have. So yeah, if we've kind of gone right from the beginning to right to the end, there's two visions of organization, if you like, and then the rest of the book is the conversations that support all of that.
So one of the things that really struck me in the foreword is that you said it was more or less it seemed like you had some kind of eureka moment, that Agendashift is an engagement model, and can you explain to us why that was so striking to you and why that maybe changed the way you...
It was actually so hilarious. So what happened? So there's 2 forewords now. So Pierre-Marie Torin wrote the one for the 2nd edition, but Daniel Mizik wrote the foreword to the first one. And he described Agendashift as an engagement model. And I thought, hang on, that's a phrase I haven't used. That's a frame I'm not. That's a term I'm not sure we even have a definition for. But what a cool phrase for what we're doing.
Yeah, it's spot on. Yeah,
a way, and you can define it in different ways. But it's kind of 3 jobs that it's doing. How do change agents, leaders, practitioners engage with organizations when there's some purposeful kind of change they want to begin? How do you get the organization to keep its staff engaged in that process or get the staff engaged and keep them engaged in that process. And how do you keep the organization, different parts of the organization, its teams, its departments, divisions, whatever, as they move at different speeds, which they will. If you're doing something like an agile transformation, that's going to hit some parts of the organization a lot differently to others. So how do you keep them still, working effectively with each other, engaged with each other, if you like? So I did a bit of a pun there on engagement, but it's a model for people engaging with organizations that encourages engagement within the organizations. And so really, really cool phrase. So I credit Daniel with that one.
And so to follow up then, like what Agendashift provides, it says it's an open framework of generative patterns and activities, a set of tools, models under the sources that inspire the framework, and tools and workshops and other ways through which they're delivered. And then you've got some activities. You've got 5 activities, which we're going to drill into one of them now. So the first one is discovery, then exploration, mapping, elaboration, and operation. So you kind of go through the whole engagement really from the start of understanding what outcomes we're trying to achieve to operating that.
There's a slight tension there I should flag up before we continue. It's 5 chapters written in a particular order. And it kind of has to be. It's one of the challenges and joys of writing a book is that you have to present things in a particular order. But of course, what the goal is something that's continuous. And to an extent, discovery is actually a continuous process, or it needs to happen, from time to time. Where are we? Where are we trying to get to? Paint a picture of where we're trying to get to, from an organization perspective, from a product perspective, and so on and so on. This is where we introduced. I've avoided naming it so far, but it's a pattern called the I-Do pattern. The ideal, obstacles, outcomes, and I've kind of taken you through it already. But what's the ideal best? What would it be like if we had it all working at its ideal best for us? I haven't defined what the it is, because it could be something lean agile. It might be something different. It might be a strategy question, a strategy challenge. It might be something purposeful or visionary, harvested from the organization. So but for the purposes of the book, we use a lean agile true north, and people reflect on that, think about how life would be if that was working at its best for us, and then what obstacles in the way of that, and then we turn obstacles into outcomes, and then we just use that pattern as a way to introduce a number of different coaching tools that easily fit into that pattern. So that brings the pattern to life, but also it's good from the point of view of your understanding of those coaching patterns as well, realizing that you can use them in a more strategic way. So much of coaching is getting people to the next commitment. Like the GROW model, for example. And you can step back a bit. The Toyota Carter, for example, does step back a bit from that, and you've got the idea that you've got this wibbly wobbly path to your next goal.
What are you going to do next?
But with what we're doing with the I-Do pattern is actually revealing much more of the landscape, modeling the landscape, in terms of obstacles and outcomes. And in the later chapters, you can organize that into something you can understand as a strategy, and then think about how you turn strategy into action and how you sustain that, how you sustain all that. But the I-Do pattern, that's fundamental to chapter 1 and chapter 2. So chapter 1, discovery, it's at a high level, true north, very, probably unobtainable, vision of the organization. And in chapter 2, we take it right down to the much more granular. We start with treating every assessment prompt. We have an assessment tool with 42 prompts in it. And the book,
I saw that. That was really nice. And you had a simpler version as well with 18 questions.
Yes. So the book works with the 18, and again, this is a really cool thing the community did was help simplify the language of the prompts. There's been improvement to the language of the prompts between the 2 editions, but you can think of every one of those prompts, whether it's 18 or 42, as a possible starting point for a conversation. As opposed to, there are other ways that assessments are used. Some are used, and they can be done well, as a way of diagnosing what's wrong, and achieving some insight for what's wrong. or they can be used a lot more cynically. They're just a way of selling a set of practices, and people see through that straight away, and they resent it. The Agendashift assessment, it genuinely is an assessment. People score the different prompts, but the scoring is really just to make sure that they've thought about it. And then the fun part is the conversations that we have afterwards. And the fact that they prioritize the prompts rather than the coach or the consultant telling them what they should fix. They've prioritized them. The obstacles are in their own words. The outcomes are in their own words. And there comes a point at which the assessment doesn't matter anymore. It's what they've decided they want to do that's important. They've agreed on outcomes.
Yeah, I'll call out 2 categories as an example. The categories are lovely, by the way: transparency, balance, collaboration, customer focus, flow, and leadership.
Yeah.
If I pick 2 of them, say balance.
Yes.
So some of the questions are, how do we kind of rate ourselves, basically? So we focus on finishing work items before starting new ones. We're careful to separate new ideas from work already started. And we actively manage our workload to keep it within our capacity. So nice language there that's kind of exec friendly.
Quite lean. I should say the 6 categories are actually the first 6 of the 9 values that were the first 9 chapters of Kanban from the inside.
Yeah.
So I, way back 2013, that's 8 years ago, did a blog post where I sort of abstracted from Kanban methods, principles, and practices, a model of 9 values, and that led to the book. There's not much of Kanban in Agendashift, but those values have stayed. And there's another model that you'll see again in chapter 3. But the lean, balance was my favorite chapter probably of Kanban from the inside. It's the most subtle of the values. And I'm learning new things about balance even now. I realized that so much of my management career was about balance, balancing between different stakeholder needs, for example. Demand versus capacity is a classic one for lean people. But there are others that lean recognizes and others that it doesn't. But yeah, I'm not surprised. I'm quite pleased you picked that one out. Those 3 prompts are very lean sounding ideas, really, when you think about it.
Yeah.
But the concept of balance is a really cool one.
To give another example, because I hear with lots of clients, we're consumer centric, we're customer centric, and almost when I hear them say that, I know they're not, because they kind of have to say it.
Yeah.
So I like these sentences you have under customer focus. So we prioritize to increase our impact on shared goals. Some organizations even struggle to prioritize. They can't sequence those priorities. They just have we need to do everything.
Yeah.
And then the next one, we incorporate customer feedback into our work. So that's a key one, when you're delivering projects, and if some other part of the organization is finding out what the value was, but we don't feed it back into our prioritization, that's a good one. Yeah. And then this is the killer one. So we treat work as unfinished until we can confirm that the customer needs have been met.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I mentioned agreement on outcomes agree on outcomes is principle number 2. Principle number 1 is start and finish with needs. Start with needs was the principle number 1 for government digital services. Start and finish with needs is the reminder that you're not done until a need is met. And it's you'll find so many of the prompts actually have the word needs in there somewhere. And there's my definition of done as well. Someone's need was met, which deliberately provocative, deliberately annoying. But when people do get it, when 99% of people get what I'm trying to do with that, and it's about taking needs seriously and getting away from thinking that we're done when we're ready to chuck it over the fence at the next person.
So, Mike, going on to chapter 3, the mapping chapter. There's a few solutions in there. One of them is the option relationship map, which I think so. You mentioned that earlier.
That's Liz and Carl's creation, and I absolutely love it. As I said, it was my favorite innovation of 2019, and it's probably the strongest tool of the 3 that are in that chapter. So there's option approach mapping, which is a pseudonym for the Cynefin 4 points exercise. The reason it goes under a pseudonym is that it's a much better exercise when you don't explain the Cynefin model first. People do that exercise very differently depending on what they do and haven't been told beforehand. And the last exercise, pathway mapping, that is based on story mapping. It's kind of story mapping with outcomes. It's in many ways the least interesting of the three, but it's the one that most clearly shows priorities. But the one in the middle of there, option relationship mapping, you're visualizing some important things. Where is there ambiguity? Where don't we know stuff? Where haven't we decided stuff? And which outcomes are most visible to and least visible to customers? And if you arrange your outcomes over that sort of 2D space and then draw relationships between them according to impact, you've got an amazing visualization of strategy or potential for strategy. Where do we need to learn? Where should we choose an easily attainable outcome for its impact on a longer term goal? Those kind of things it visualizes really well. I love it.
One of the things that struck me about the option relationship map was you did different levels of complexity on the board, and you let people do that without, as you said, mentioning the Cynefin framework, and kind of that you explained it in very simple terms. And then what you did was you showed the dependencies between the different items. And I loved what you said, for example, on Clubhouse last night, for example, when you were saying that, you don't just put a problem in one domain, it could be in several domains at the same time. And you had the dependencies between them. So you could have a lot of work that's complicated where you need some experts and maybe you need to do some research, but maybe it's depending on something where we need to go beyond the experts, where we need some fresh thinking.
Yes. Well, I really do like the 4 point. I mean, we're sort of switching between the 4 points and option relationship mapping here, but I do love the 4 points exercise. Yeah. And you are, because we're working with outcomes that we've generated, we're mapping 15, 20 outcomes or something like that typically. It's not just one thing. And we're not saying, is this, or is it that? We find extreme examples and then we organize everything else relative to those. And you are, making sense of things. It's a sense-making exercise. And this thing of finding extreme examples and then organizing things between them actually is a technique that applies to at least the first two maps, if not the third one as well. There's a tendency when you get lots of sticky notes on the whiteboard is you want to cluster them and dot vote them and all the rest of it. And you're throwing away 90% of the information when you do that. And we're doing the opposite. We're spreading things out and so that you can see the relationships between them. So you can start to get a strategic view of things. And if that dot voting thing that's back to that idea of coaching conversations being just about the next commitment. If all you're going to do is decide the next thing you're going to do, well, why do we generate all that other stuff?
Sometimes it's just about understanding what's going on, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then if I move on to chapter 4, Mike, into the elaboration. So, like, say you choose an outcome, and then you earlier on you would have been looking at the obstacles and so on. And now we got this thing called challenge mapping. And what I loved about the language here was, how might we?
Yes. So so that's one of the areas where we've made some improvements since the first edition is we've improved the ideation part, and we've challenge mapping is a tool that if you've done design sprint or if you're familiar with design sprints, you might come across challenge mapping and the how might we question. And it's actually a really good discipline. It's a great way of making sure that the things you capture on sticky notes aren't sneaking in solutions prematurely. We're trying to get the issues up on the board, the challenges up on the board. That's why it's called challenge mapping. And then in how many different ways could we respond to those challenges? And we do a number of exercises, all of which are designed really to get as much up in the air as possible. What are the challenges? What are our signs of success, for example? In how many different ways could we make just 15% progress towards that outcome, borrowing from liberating structures there. And And so, if you're familiar with design sprints, bit of design thinking as well. So we've beefed up that ideation part, and then there's some more sort of classic stuff in there, A3 and stuff like that, which lean people would easily recognise. Hypotheses, all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. I had some example ones here that I'll just read out for the listeners. So, like, for example, how might we have an idea of timescales for delivery? How might we recognize revenue sooner? How might we grow or sustain our business? How might we change the world, make it a better place? Really striking and very kind of optimistic questions.
Yes, well, I am an optimist. Yeah, that probably comes. So, optimist and pluralist. I love all these different sources, and I think love is almost not too strong a word. It's not just cherry picking. It's enthusing about them and sharing some of the spirit of them and integrating them. And it turns out that outcomes are a really good way of integrating things. I mean, I did that same trick really in Kanban from the inside with values, but it's actually much easier with outcomes. So that's really what makes it hold together.
So can you take us through chapter 5, Mike, the operation piece? So can you just give us a little summary of
take chapters 5 and 6 together. So chapter 5 of the first edition, I was desperate to avoid sounding at all prescriptive about the tools that you should be using to sustain the change related work. But I did mention Kanban, I did mention Changeban, I did mention A3 and so on. What I did this time, you could call it cheating if you like. Again, not wanting to prescribe anything, but there's an exercise to design your outside-in service delivery review, which is a tool you could do. But in the book, all we do is design your own, thinking about who's invited, think about who's going to speak in what order, think about what metrics that each layer of the outside-in service delivery review might want to be tracking and speaking to. And so on. And then more powerful questions like who's invited, more profound questions, and realizing that every feedback loop in your organization, every workshop that you have in your organization is a chance to invite people. And we can be deliberate about that. And we can make sure that we span multiple levels of seniority, for example, in our invites. My rule of 3, at least 3 levels of seniority in the room for any interesting event. And you can ask that question, about who's going to speak to each layer in customer, organization, product, platform, teams. Who's going to speak for each of those. And we do the same with Changeman as well. It's just presented as a game, but it's very obvious that it's a tool for managing experiments, portfolios of experiments, with some great learning from Lean Startup built into it, things like, valuable, feasible, usable, those kind of things. So I introduced them as workshop exercises rather than as prescriptive things that you should be doing in your organization, but people can make up their own minds as to whether they want to use those tools or not. Then there's the real groundwork. So that's the stuff I mentioned earlier, the connection with dialogic organization developments, generative organization developments, things like social constructionism as well, realizing that organizations, you can't just look at them as process and structure. They are created through the conversations that people have. They are sustained, self-producing, to use the jargon, self-producing through the conversations that they have. And remarkably, that same concept of things being self-producing is there in the systems world as well. In viable systems model, if your organization doesn't have the mechanisms to sustain itself, it will die. It's pretty obvious when you think about it. And what's so cool is that I've reached some conclusions that are very compatible with 2 very different worlds. But reach some conclusions that are very compatible with both. The idea that we need participation that connects strategy, delivery, and organization development. As I said before, strategy is something that happens to you in a lot of agile teams, and that's a really sad thing. People aren't having the opportunity to participate in the strategies of their teams and of the wider organization that team is supporting. That is a shame. It's ironic, even, when we talk about teams being autonomous, but actually have so little control over their strategy and so little influence over the strategy of people around them. So I think that's an essential part of a wholehearted organization. I think it's an essential part of a deliberately adaptive organization, and I think the theory would bear me out on that. And it's you could call it confirmation bias, but it's really nice when the theory confirms your suspicion. So it's been been fun, bottoming that stuff out over the last couple of years.
Mike, it rang a lot of bells for me, and I might even try some of the service delivery review formats that you have. That's very practical help for people as well, because
Yes.
people can go into chaos a little bit if you don't kind of give them something to start with.
Again, actually, that exercise, that service delivery, it was a real meeting that I did when I was in government digital, and it was actually the thing that set me on the path towards sociocracy. Realizing who represents each of those layers, and realizing that people had feet in multiple layers and all the rest of it. And this is interesting. I have to dig in a bit further.
Yeah, you've raised my curiosity as well. I'm going to check it out a little bit more.
Yes.
Mike, I want to thank you very much for coming on the show today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And best of luck with the conference. Looking forward to hearing the lineup and all the rave reviews. I'm sure.
Yeah, so watch the space for the announcements, and agendashift.com/conference will take you to the page for that.
Good stuff, Mike. Thank you so much.
Thank you. See you then.
Thank you. Take care.
If you would like your voice message to be featured on a future podcast episode, please leave a voice message at anchor.fm/Xagility/message. That's anchor.fm/Xagility/message. Thank you.